In the 21st century, long distance often means hours apart by car or plane, bridged in seconds by text messages or video calls. But in the 1500s, distance was not measured in hours, it was measured in weeks, months, even years. To be separated by miles was to be separated by silence. The very concept of distance was heavier. Roads were dangerous, poorly built, and vulnerable to bandits. A journey of 50 miles could take days on horseback, longer on foot. Oceans and seas were barriers few lovers could cross without months of planning. To love someone from afar was to accept uncertainty and certainty about their safety, about their feelings, even about their survival. For most people, the long-distance relationship was not a choice. It was imposed by duty, marriage, contracts, trade, or war. Lovers were often separated not because they wanted to test their devotion, but because the world demanded it. A soldier was sent abroad. A merchant chased fortunes in far ports. A noblewoman was married to someone in another land, never to return. The lovers left behind had little control. Imagine a young couple in England in the mid-1500s. He is called to war in France, or perhaps ventures as a sailor on a voyage of exploration. She remains at home, her world bound to the village, the fields, the church. Their relationship, once intimate and immediate, is now stretched across a gulf of silence. There are no telegraphs, no letters guaranteed to arrive, no quick reassurances. She waits, sometimes for months, for a single message carried by a rider or a ship. Each letter could be the first or the last. Distance also shaped emotions differently. Today, we see long distance as frustrating but manageable. In the 1500s, it could be agonizing. To wait months, with no word required, a different kind of faith. Trust was not a romantic luxury, it was survival. Lovers had to believe in each other without evidence, hold on to affection without reminders, and endure rumors or doubts with no way to confirm the truth. Class and status also determined how lovers experienced distance. Nobles might be separated by political marriages, sending letters sealed with wax, guarded by messengers. Their words could be poetic, filled with metaphors, carefully written to survive the scrutiny of those who might intercept them. Meanwhile, peasants, often illiterate, relied more on oral promises, vows whispered before departure, memories carried like relics. For them, love at a distance meant waiting at the edge of a road, hoping to see a familiar figure return. Religious life amplified the weight of distance. The church shaped the way people thought about love, duty, and absence. Lovers were reminded that separation was a test, that fidelity was sacred, and that patience was a virtue. Many endured long silences, believing that God was watching their devotion as closely as their partner. But distance in the 1500s was not always tragic. It gave birth to a culture of longing poetry, songs, ballads, and whispered stories of lovers who endured separation. Absence became romanticized, proof of sincerity. True love waits, they believed, and the farther the distance, the greater the proof. In this way, distance was both a curse and a crucible. It broke weak bonds, but it forged strong ones into legend. The concept of long-distance love in the 1500s was not about missing texts or late calls, it was about silence, patience, and faith in the unseen. To love from afar was to risk heartbreak, but also to experience one of the deepest forms of devotion possible in that age. Because in a world where death could come with the next battle, the next voyage, or the next plague, to wait faithfully was an act of courage. To understand long-distance love in the 1500s, we must remember that love itself was divided by class. Who you were determined not only whom you could marry, but also how separation was experienced. In an age where birth defined destiny, distance was not just geography, was social. For the nobility, marriage was rarely about romance. It was about alliances, land, and political advantage. A duke's daughter in France might be married off to a nobleman in Spain, never meeting him until the wedding day, and then living hundreds of miles from the family she left behind. Her letters, written in careful script and sealed with wax, were less about longing than about duty. Reports of estates, news of heirs, reassurances of loyalty. If love developed at all, it was a fragile flower growing in the cracks of politics. Yet, even in these arranged unions, separation left its mark. A nobleman might spend months at court, away from his wife. A queen might be separated from her king for years as he pursued wars abroad. Distance in these circles was softened by scribes, couriers, and education. They had the tools to write eloquently, to express longing through poetry, to immortalize absence in ink. For the common folk, distance looked very different. A peasant woman in England, illiterate and bound to her village, could not write to her husband if he travelled to work in the fields of another lord, or marched off as a soldier. Her letters were oral promises made before he left. Words remembered, prayers whispered. Her love was carried in her memory, not on parchment. If he returned, the bond endured. If he did not, silence was her only answer. Class also influenced who was allowed to feel love across distance. Among the wealthy, affairs of the heart were tolerated as long as duty was fulfilled. Kings and nobles might write passionate letters to mistresses, while treating wives as political assets. The poor, on the other hand, faced harsher realities. A farmer's daughter could not choose a distant lover, if her family depended on her marrying the boy next door for survival. Love, across villages or, worse, across classes, was often forbidden. Yet forbidden love has always found a way. Stories circulated of maidens meeting traveling merchants in secret, or soldiers leaving behind village sweethearts with whispered vows to return. These romances were fragile, dangerous, and often tragic, but they reveal how distance magnified passion. When society forbade contact, longing only grew sharper. Distance also highlighted inequality. A noblewoman might wait for letters, gilded with careful words, while a peasant woman waited for nothing more than a footstep on the path. The tools of communication, paper, ink, couriers, were luxuries. For most, distance was endured in silence, broken only when fate allowed a reunion. But, whether noble or peasant, the emotional weight of separation was the same: the ache of not knowing. To love across distance in the 1500s was to accept that the world could intervene at any moment. Bandits, disease, war, or simply the slowness of travel. Months of waiting could end in joy, or in grief. In this sense, class divided the methods, but not the heart. A noblewoman's ink-stained letters and a peasant girl's whispered prayers were two sides of the same coin. Expressions of faith in a love stretched across impossible miles. In today's world, distance is softened by technology. Lovers, separated by oceans, can exchange messages in seconds, hear each other's voices, even see each other's faces through glowing screens. But in the 1500s, distance was a wall, a silence, a test that mattered more deeply than most of us can imagine today. The first reason distance mattered so much was time. A letter sent in the 1500s could take weeks, even months, to reach its destination, if it arrived at all. Carried by horseback across muddy roads, or by ship across stormy seas, every message was vulnerable to theft, destruction, or delay. To wait for a reply was to endure an eternity of uncertainty. A promise of love could be lost to a river, stolen by a bandit, or buried in war. Each word, each seal, carried incredible weight because it might be the only word received for months or forever. The second reason was mortality. Life in the 1500s was precarious. Plagues struck without warning, wars consumed thousands, childbirth was perilous, and injuries that seem minor today could be fatal. Lovers who parted knew there was a real chance they might never see each other again. Every farewell carried the shadow of death. To be separated was not just inconvenient, was existential. Third, distance was rarely voluntary. In modern times, couples often choose long-distance relationships for education, work, or personal reasons. In the 1500s, separation was usually imposed by duty. A husband conscripted into war, a wife married off to a distant land, a merchant sent abroad by necessities were not choices. They were commands of survival or politics. To love at a distance meant to live at the mercy of forces far greater than oneself. Distance also mattered more because of trust. With no instant reassurance, lovers had to rely on faith alone. Was the other faithful? Did they still care? Were they even alive? Rumors could poison hearts, but confirmation was rare. A noblewoman might wait months for a letter, clinging to scraps of wax and parchment as proof of devotion. A peasant woman might wait at the edge of a field, scanning the horizon each evening, never knowing if her lover would return. And yet, because of this wait, love at a distance in the 1500s carried a certain gravity. Words meant more. Promises meant more. A single letter, fragile and ink-stained, could be treasured for years. A vow whispered before departure could echo in the memory of the one left behind, stronger than 100 text messages today. Distance mattered more because it transformed love into something sacred. To endure it required patience, discipline, and unwavering hope. It was not a temporary inconvenience, but a crucible that tested loyalty. Many loves failed under its pressure, but those that survived became legendary. Looking back, we see that the 1500s forged long-distance relationships into something both heartbreaking and heroic. They revealed the raw essence of love, stripped of convenience. Faith in another soul, across silence, across time, across danger. In a sense, distance in that age magnified love, for if two people could endure months of silence, oceans of uncertainty, and the ever-present spectre of mortality, then what they shared was not ordinary, it was extraordinary. And that is why distance mattered more in the 1500s, because it demanded not just affection, but courage. In the 1500s, when lovers were torn apart by distance, the letter was everything. It was not simply a message, it was presence. A fragile piece of parchment could carry longing, devotion, and even the illusion of closeness across hundreds of miles. To write a letter in this era was to carve out a piece of one's soul. Ink was not casual, every stroke of the quill demanded intention. Because paper was scarce, costly, and precious, a single letter might take hours to compose. And for the recipient, those words would be read and reread until the parchment itself wore thin. For nobles and literate elites, love letters became both an art and a necessity. They blended intimacy with poetry, borrowing metaphors from religion, mythology, and nature to express feelings that distance magnified. A nobleman might describe his beloved as the sun that lights his dark absence. Or a queen might assure her distant husband that her heart beats only for him, even as politics force them apart. But letters were not always extravagant. Sometimes they were simple and desperate. I am alive, I wait for you. Return to me. These words, though plain, carried immense power because they crossed the abyss of silence. For the common people, letters were more difficult. Literacy rates were low. Many peasants could not write or read at all. In these cases, they relied on priests, scribes, or educated friends to write on their behalf. Imagine the vulnerability of dictating private feelings to another, knowing they would put your love into words. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Still, even dictated letters became lifelines. Letters carried more than words, they carried physical presence. The paper itself, touched by the sender, folded by their hands, sealed with their mark, was an intimate object. To hold it was to hold a piece of them. Some lovers even pressed small tokens into letters. A lock of hair, a flower, a ribbon. These tokens turned a message into a relic, something sacred to be treasured during long absences. Yet, the role of letters extended beyond romance. They preserved trust. They reassured parents that daughters were alive in faraway lands. They confirmed marriages, business partnerships, and political alliances. But for lovers, the letter was uniquely powerful. It was a whisper across silence, a flame kept alive in the dark. The delay, of course, was agonizing. Weeks could pass before a letter arrived, and by then the words might already be outdated. "I am well" might no longer be true. "I will return soon" could be overturned by war or illness. Still, even stale words were precious. To know that someone had thought of you weeks ago was better than silence. In this way, letters became not only communication, but survival. They kept love alive when everything else, distance, danger, time conspired to extinguish it. A letter in the 1500s was more than ink on parchment. It was a journey, a risk, and often a secret. Writing was only half the battle. The greater challenge was getting the message safely into the hands of the one it was meant for. Unlike today, where a message can be sent instantly across the globe, letters in the 1500s had to travel by human hands. Couriers on horseback, servants, merchants, even traveling pilgrims carried these fragile tokens of love across vast distances. Each journey was vulnerable. Rain could smudge ink, horses could be robbed on the road, ships could sink, and sometimes a messenger simply vanished with the letter. Because of this uncertainty, secrecy became essential. Lovers often sealed their letters with wax and signet rings, pressing unique emblems into the soft wax to prove authenticity. To receive a letter bearing the beloved's personal seal was to hold undeniable proof. These words are truly theirs. Breaking the seal was a moment of intimacy, a ritual charged with anticipation. But privacy was never guaranteed. Servants who carried messages sometimes read them out of curiosity. Political authorities could intercept letters if they suspected conspiracy. Even family members might open correspondence, especially in noble households where alliances and affairs of the heart were closely monitored. A letter of love could quickly become evidence of scandal. This lack of privacy led to creative strategies. Lovers developed coded language and metaphors to conceal meaning. A simple sentence about the weather might secretly declare longing. A reference to a flower could symbolize fidelity. Poems, biblical verses, or mythical references were layered with double meaning, so that even if a letter was intercepted, only the intended recipient would understand its true message. Some even risked smuggling letters inside books, garments, or packages, trusting that hidden words were safer than plain envelopes. Every act of secrecy reflected both the fragility and the intensity of long-distance love. For nobles, messengers were often professional couriers bound by loyalty, but even they could be bribed or threatened. For peasants, Letters were usually entrusted to whomever happened to be traveling in the right direction. A merchant passing through town might carry a folded parchment for a small fee. Trusting a stranger with your most intimate words was an act of desperation and courage. This uncertainty added to the emotional weight of long-distance relationships. Sending a letter meant weeks of waiting in silence, not knowing if it would arrive, be lost, or be read by the wrong hands. Receiving one was a miracle, proof that love had crossed impossible miles and survived the perils of the journey. The rituals of messengers and seals made love letters feel sacred. To write was an act of vulnerability. To seal was an act of trust. To deliver was an act of faith. And to receive was a joy so deep that people often carried letters with them, tucked into clothing, rereading them until the ink faded. Distance was difficult enough, but the risk of interception, the lack of privacy, and the slow pace of delivery made every word precious. In a sense, the insecurity of the process magnified the devotion behind it. Because if two people were willing to risk exposure, danger, and silence just to send words of longing across miles, then their love was truly extraordinary. In the 1500s, a love letter was not something dashed off casually, tossed into a mailbox, and forgotten. It was an investment of money, time, and emotional risk. To send words across miles was a privilege, and often a sacrifice. The first cost was material. Paper was not cheap. While nobles and scholars had access to parchment and fine writing materials, common folk rarely did. Paper was imported, scarce, and carefully rationed. Ink required preparation. Made from oak galls, iron salts, or soutane quills had to be cut and sharpened. Writing itself was a craft, not a convenience. For many, simply acquiring the tools to write a letter was an effort in itself. The second cost was education. Literacy in the 1500s was far from universal. Among nobles, literacy rates were higher. But even then, not every aristocrat wrote fluently. For peasants, literacy was rare, often limited to priests, scribes, and a handful of merchants. This meant that many lovers who wished to write could not. They had to pay someone else to compose their letters. Imagine dictating your most private feelings to a local priest or clerk, trusting them to put your love into words. Privacy was surrendered, and devotion became a public transaction. Then came the cost of delivery. In a world without postal systems as we know them, messages traveled by courier, merchant, or traveler. Nobles could afford trusted messengers on horseback, but peasants relied on whoever happened to be going their way, a merchant, a soldier, even a stranger. Sometimes a coin was exchanged for the service. Sometimes trust alone had to suffice. Either way, delivery was uncertain, and the risk of loss was high. All of this meant that love letters were not frequent. They were rare, deliberate, and treasured. A single message could represent weeks of saving, planning, and risk. For those separated by distance, receiving a letter was not a casual moment. It was monumental. To unfold parchment sealed with wax, to read words carried across storms and roads, was to touch devotion itself. The cost also heightened the emotional value. Because letters were so difficult to produce and deliver, they carried weight far beyond their words. To write one was to prove commitment. To receive one was to feel chosen. A lover who sent a letter had not only thought of you, they had sacrificed for you. Nobles sometimes elevated this further by commissioning letters written in elegant calligraphy, adorned with symbols, or even composed by poets. For them, the costs became a statement of status as well as love. For the poor, a single sheet filled with uneven handwriting carried equal if not greater weight, because of the struggle it represented. In this way, The cost of communication in the 1500s shaped long-distance love into something profound. Today, we can send thousands of messages a year, each one carrying little meaning because of its abundance. But in the 1500s, a single letter could be read hundreds of times, memorized word for word, carried against the skin, preserved for years. And because letters were costly, many relied instead on memory. Lovers repeated parting words in their minds, clinging to them as substitutes for correspondence. A whispered vow before separation could be replayed endlessly in the silence of absence. Words spoken once had to last for months, sometimes years. The scarcity of letters and the sacrifice they required ensured that long-distance relationships in the 1500s were anything but casual. They demanded resilience, patience, and devotion. Every message sent was proof of endurance. Every letter received was proof of survival. For love at a distance was not measured in texts or calls, but in the rare, fragile treasures of ink on paper, tokens of loyalty carried across silence at great cost. In the 1500s, love and marriage were not the same thing. Today, we imagine marriage as the celebration of passion, intimacy, and choice. But 500 years ago, marriage was less about love and more about duty, property, and power. For the nobility and royal families, marriage was a political weapon. A daughter was not simply a child, she was a bridge. By 16, she would leave her family, her land, her language, and her country to live in a castle hundreds of miles away. For her, love was not the priority. Duty was. She might exchange letters with her family, but her new life would be one of separation from everything she had known. For men, marriage was equally strategic. A nobleman might be married to a woman, not for affection, but for her dowry, her family connections, or her ability to produce heirs. Love could come later, or not at all. Yet, despite these arrangements, passion did not vanish. Letters between couples reveal moments of tenderness, longing, and desire. Love found ways to grow even in marriages born of strategy. Among the common folk, marriage was still tied to duty, but in different ways. For farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, marriage was often about survival. A woman might marry a man from another village to secure land or join families. A man might marry to bring labor into his household. Love was welcome, but it was rarely the foundation. The foundation was necessity. This meant that long-distance relationships in the 1500s were shaped as much by family duty as by personal choice. A young man might be in love with a woman in his village, but his parents might arrange for him to marry someone wealthier in a nearby town. A young woman might promise her heart to a childhood friend, only to be married off to a landowner miles away. Distance, in these cases, was not only physical, it was emotional. Lovers were torn apart, not by oceans, but by obligations they could not escape. And yet, in the hidden spaces between duty, love still bloomed. Secret letters were exchanged. Lovers found ways to meet in marketplaces, during festivals, or in the shadows of the church. In an age where social class and family obligation defined most unions, every long-distance love that survived was an act of rebellion. Marriage was strategy. Duty was law. But love was the quiet force that refused to die, even when distance made it nearly impossible. Because, in the 1500s, to love at a distance was not just about miles. It was about resisting the weight of duty. It was about holding on to a bond when the world demanded obedience. And for those who dared, it was proof that the heart could defy the strictest of rules. If there was one theme that defined relationships in the 1500s, it was obligation. Families, kingdoms, and communities demanded loyalty to duty above loyalty to the heart. And in that system, many lovers found themselves torn apart not by oceans, not by wars, but by expectations they could not defy. A young woman in Renaissance Italy, for example, might grow up secretly in love with a neighbor's son. They would exchange glances at church, perhaps share whispered words in the marketplace. Yet, when she reached marrying age, her family could arrange her union with an older man of wealth, perhaps from another city. Overnight, her romantic dreams were ended. She would be escorted miles away to live with a stranger, while the boy she loved was left behind. Their relationship was not destroyed by distance of geography alone, but by the unyielding wall of family duty. Men, too, were bound by these obligations. A young nobleman could fall in love with a woman of lower status, only to be forced into a marriage with someone of equal rank. To resist was not only to risk scandal, it was to risk the family fortune, inheritance, and honor. In such cases, distance became permanent. The lovers might continue in secret, meeting rarely, or they might resign themselves to memory. Either way, their love was reshaped by duty, turned into longing rather than fulfillment. Even within marriages, obligation could separate couples. Husbands were sent abroad for war or trade. Wives were left behind to manage estates, farms, or children. Fidelity was demanded, even when months or years passed without reunion. And while letters served as bridges, the silence of obligation was often unbearable. Many relationships did not survive such strain. Obligation also worked in more subtle ways. Religious vows could separate lovers, as one entered a convent or monastery. Pilgrimages and holy duties took men and women far from home for years. Once again, distance was not chosen, it was commanded. To resist was to resist God, family, or king. The pain of such separations gave rise to countless songs, poems, and tales of the time. Ballads of lovers, torn apart by arranged marriages or bound by vows of duty, were sung in taverns and courts alike. Audiences wept because they recognized themselves in these stories. Everyone knew someone whose heart had been broken by obligation. Everyone had seen love sacrificed for family, wealth, or faith. And yet, there was also defiance. Some lovers clung to each other in secret, meeting when they could, writing letters under false names, or promising to reunite despite the world's commands. These stories often ended tragically: betrayal, discovery, or exile, but the very act of defiance revealed how powerful love was. Distance, when born of obligation, could not extinguish the flame. For those who endured it, love across duty became a crucible of faith. It was not casual affection, icily discarded. It was devotion tested by the heaviest chains society could impose. To remain loyal across such distance was to prove that love was stronger than law, stronger than politics, stronger than silence. This is why long-distance relationships in the 1500s carried a depth we struggle to imagine today. Because when the world demanded obedience, and two hearts still chose each other, even across years of absence, they were not simply in love, they were resisting an entire system. In the 1500s, Europe was a continent in constant motion. Wars flared between kingdoms, empires expanded overseas, and armies marched endlessly across borders. For countless men, Duty meant leaving home for campaigns that could last months or even years. And for those they left behind, wives, lovers, and families, this meant enduring the long silence of separation. A soldier's departure was never certain. When he marched away under the banner of his king, there was no guarantee he would return. Battles were brutal, disease swept through camps, and supply lines often collapsed. The promise to come home was always shadowed by the possibility of death. Yet men went, not always by choice, but often by command, and their absence carved deep wounds into the hearts of those they loved. For wives, the soldier's absence meant carrying double burdens. She became head of the household, tending crops, raising children, managing debt sore, while living with the gnawing uncertainty of her husband's fate. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and the silence of no news was often worse than bad news itself. A letter, if it arrived, was a lifeline, but many never did. Sailors and explorers faced even longer separations. The 1500s were the age of great voyages. Men boarded ships bound for the Americas, Africa, or Asia, chasing trade, conquest, or discovery. Their journeys lasted years. For the women they left behind, these absences were not only painful but dangerous. A sailor might never return, claimed by storms or foreign shores. His family could fall into poverty, his children grow up fatherless, his wife widowed without certainty. Love strained under such distances. Promises whispered at the dockside had to endure years without touch, without voice, without certainty. Many sailors returned to find their wives remarried, believing them dead. Others came home to discover their lovers had been faithful through silence. Either outcome reveals the intensity of such long-distance relationships. Faith was tested beyond what most could endure today. For young lovers, war and the sea also meant forced separations before relationships could even begin. A young man might pledge his heart to a village girl, only to be conscripted into a lord's army or pressed into naval service. Their connection became a memory, sustained by words spoken once, treasured for years. Yet, separation also created its own rituals. Soldiers departing for war often gave tokens to their beloveds: a ring, a ribbon, a lock of hair to serve as physical reminders of their bond. Women, in turn, sent prayers and promises. These objects became anchors of hope, carried close to the skin, kissed in silence, and guarded as if they were sacred relics. The reality was that most relationships did not survive such strain. War took lives. Distance frayed bonds. But those that did endure became the stuff of legend. To remain faithful across years of silence was rare, and because it was rare, it was revered. This is what made long-distance love during war and exploration in the 1500s so powerful. It was never easy, never casual, never guaranteed. It was a gamble of the heart, played against time, distance, and death itself. And in that gamble, true devotion shone brighter than ever. Every farewell in the 1500s carried a shadow. When soldiers marched to war or sailors boarded ships bound for unknown horizons, they and their loved ones knew the truth. Many would never come back. This constant awareness of mortality gave long-distance relationships in the 1500s a unique weight, turning every kiss, every promise, every letter into something sacred. The fear of never returning was not abstract. Wars in the 16th century were brutal. Battles were fought with pikes, swords, and primitive firearms, leaving fields littered with the dead. Disease often killed more soldiers than combat. Armies marched into foreign lands with little chance of adequate supplies, and hunger devoured regiments faster than enemy steel. To leave for war was to walk into the jaws of death. For those who stayed behind, this fear was a daily companion. Wives woke each morning not knowing if their husbands still lived. Lovers whispered prayers, waiting for news that might never come. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Word of massacres, lost ships, or failed campaigns reached villages long before official reports. And in that uncertain silence, the heart wrestled with despair. Sailors faced even greater uncertainty. To step onto a ship bound for the Americas or the East was to risk storms, scurvy, pirates, and shipwreck. Thousands of men who left European ports in the 1500s vanished into the sea. Their names never heard again. For their families, there was no closure, only endless waiting. A woman might spend years looking toward the horizon, wondering if her beloved was alive in some distant land or lost beneath the waves. This fear shaped the way people loved. Farewells were often ceremonies of grief as much as hope. A soldier might press a token into his wife's hand, his ring, his knife, or a scrap of cloth from his uniform, knowing it might serve as his only memorial. A sailor might kiss his children goodbye with tears in his eyes, uncertain if they would even remember him when he returned, if he ever did. Because death was so present, words became immortal. Promises exchanged before departure were repeated endlessly in memory. "I will come back to you" became both a vow and a prayer. Lovers clung to these words like lifelines, even when logic told them otherwise. The possibility of death made devotion more desperate, more intense. And yet, this constant fear also birthed betrayal. Some who were left behind could not endure the silence. Wives remarried after years without news, believing their husbands dead. Lovers moved on, seeking comfort in the arms of others. To the one returning scarred, weary, but alive, such betrayals were crushing. To the one who had waited faithfully, however, reunion was proof that love had survived death's shadow. The fear of never returning created extremes. It broke some bonds entirely, but it also forged unbreakable devotion in others. For those who endured, distance was not just separation, it was survival. This ever-present fear reveals why long-distance relationships in the 1500s were unlike anything today. Modern couples, even separated by continents, live with the assumption of reunion. Flights, technology, and health give hope. In the 1500s, lovers embraced, knowing that each goodbye might be their last. To love under such conditions was not merely romantic, it was courageous. In the 1500s, when soldiers went to war or sailors departed for distant voyages, farewells were not just casual goodbyes. They were moments heavy with ritual, fear, and sacred promises. For many couples, these promises were the only bond that would remain once distance and silence took over. Before departure, lovers often exchanged tokens as symbols of devotion. A man might give his beloved a ring, a ribbon, or a small object from his person. Women often gave embroidered handkerchiefs, pieces of cloth, or even locks of hair. These items became anchors of memory, carried into battle or onto the seas as reminders of the bond left behind. For those who stayed, the tokens were cherished like relics, pressed to the lips in prayer, kissed during moments of longing, or held tightly during nights of solitude. The spoken promise mattered even more. Words carried enormous weight in a world where letters were rare and uncertain. Vows such as "I will return to you," "My heart is yours alone," or "Wait for me until I come back" became lifelines. A whispered declaration at the door or on the docks could sustain a lover through years of absence. These promises were repeated endlessly in memory, transforming into both comfort and torment. Religious rituals also shaped farewells. Many couples prayed together before separation, kneeling in churches or invoking saints for protection. A soldier might promise, not only fidelity, but also to fight with honor, believing his conduct in battle would reflect on the woman waiting for him. A wife might vow to remain faithful, believing her endurance was a spiritual duty as much as a personal one. In this way, promises were not only romantic, they were bound by the weight of faith. But promises also carried risks. To break them was to invite shame. Communities judged harshly those who abandoned their vows too quickly. A woman who remarried while her husband was still alive, a man who sought other lovers while his wife waited, could be condemned as dishonorable. And yet, many did break their vows not out of malice, but out of desperation, loneliness, or survival. Still, the power of these promises was undeniable. They appear in countless ballads and poems of the age, where departing lovers pledged eternal faithfulness, and those left behind swore to wait no matter how long. Some of these stories ended in tragedy, with one lover dying far from home while the other kept waiting. Others ended in miraculous reunions, with vows fulfilled against all odds. Both reveal the extraordinary importance of promises in sustaining love across distance. These farewells also highlight a truth about long-distance relationships in the 1500s. They were as much about hope as about love. Promises gave people something to hold on to when distance threatened to break them apart. Without these spoken or symbolic bonds, many relationships would have collapsed under the weight of silence. And so, the act of promising before departure became a ritual of survival. For the soldier marching into war, for the sailor setting sail on uncertain seas, and for the lover left behind, the promise was not just words. It was the fragile bridge across which love might endure. Because, in a world where death and distance were constant companions, the promise of return was the most precious gift one could give and the most courageous one to believe. In the 1500s, love among royals was never private. It was political currency. Every marriage between kings, queens, and noble families was less about hearts and more about crowns. And when those marriages crossed borders, as they so often did, the result was a constant dance of long-distance alliances. A royal wedding in the 16th century was rarely the romantic celebration we imagine today. Instead, it was a treaty signed with rings instead of ink. A French princess married to a Spanish prince symbolized peace between nations. A Scottish queen betrothed to a French king's heir created bonds that could change the fate of Europe. These unions were designed to keep wars at bay, secure trade, and strengthen dynasties. But once the vows were spoken, reality set in. Distance. A young woman might be sent hundreds of miles away from her homeland, never to return. She would leave behind her family, her friends, her language, even her culture. Letters became her only lifeline to the world she once knew. And while couriers faithfully carried sealed messages, the journey was slow and uncertain. Months could pass before she heard her mother's voice, again written in delicate script, arriving with news already outdated. Royal men, too, endured separation. Kings were often called to war, to diplomacy, to journeys across their kingdoms. A queen might wait in one palace while her husband negotiated treaties or commanded armies far away. She might receive letters filled with strategy, orders, or reassurance, but rarely intimacy. And so, even within a marriage designed to unite kingdoms, a queen could feel like a widow. Her husband's presence reduced to words on parchment. Yet, despite these circumstances, love sometimes bloomed. History preserves letters where kings confessed longing, where queens spoke of affection. In the case of politically arranged marriages that grew into true bonds, separation could be agonizing. For those rare couples who discovered love in duty, distance was not just political inconvenience, it was heartbreak. For many others, however, love at a distance was complicated by alliances. A nobleman might be forced to write letters that mixed romance with politics, weaving declarations of affection with negotiations over land and power. A queen's letter to her husband might be read not only by him, but by his advisers, who studied every line for political meaning. In such cases, intimacy was hidden beneath layers of metaphor, or sacrificed entirely. This made royal long-distance relationships some of the most fragile and yet, paradoxically, some of the most influential of the 1500s. A single letter could spark trust between nations or ignite war. A single absence could lead to betrayal, scandal, or political collapse. For the people watching, these royal relationships were both distant and deeply symbolic. The marriage of a queen to a foreign king might mean peace for their village. The separation of royal lovers might mean war. Love, duty, and distance were not just personal struggles, they were affairs of state. And yet, beneath the weight of crowns and treaties, the human heart remained the same. Kings and queens longed for each other. Noble brides wept at farewells. Princes promised to write. Princesses carried tokens across borders. Duty demanded obedience, but love whispered in the spaces between the lines of carefully sealed letters. To be royal in the 1500s was to live under constant scrutiny. To love at a distance, in such a world, was to risk scandal, war, and heartbreak. Yet it was also to prove that even the most powerful crowns could not silence the human heart. The 1500s gave us some of the most fascinating love stories in history. Royal romances carried not in whispers, but in letters and symbols of longing. Among these, none is more famous than the courtship of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Anne was not just another lady of the English court. Educated in France, fluent in culture and charm, she stood out from the women Henry had known. Their relationship began not in marriage, but in distance. Henry, the king, bound by marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and Anne, the unattainable courtier who resisted his advances. For years, Henry pursued her not with empty gestures, but with letters. 17 of Henry's love letters to Anne survive today, preserved in the Vatican Library. They reveal a king stripped of his usual authority, writing not as ruler but as suitor. In one letter, he calls her "my mistress and friend," confessing that his heart is wholly yours. In another, he begs for a reply, agonized by silence. "I beg you earnestly to let me know your intention. I am not at ease until I know." These words, written in ink nearly 500 years ago, echo the same desperation felt by anyone who has ever waited for a reply in a long-distance love. For Henry and Anne, letters bridged an emotional distance as much as a physical one. Their exchanges carried flirtation, longing, and eventually promises of a future together. Yet these letters were also dangerous. They risked discovery, scandal, and political upheaval. Every courier who carried them bore not only words of passion, but potential seeds of revolution. Anne's resistance only deepened Henry's obsession. Unlike many women of the time, she refused to become his mistress. She demanded marriage, legitimacy, and recognition. For years, their relationship existed in this liminal space, bound by longing, sustained by promises, but constrained by duty. Their love was, in essence, a long-distance courtship. Emotional miles stretched between desire and reality. And when Henry finally broke with the Catholic Church to marry Anne, their relationship proved that long-distance love could alter history. From whispered promises to written vows, their devotion sparked the English Reformation, reshaping religion and politics across Europe. But Henry and Anne were not the only royal lovers separated by distance. Across Europe, letters preserved similar stories. Mary, Queen of Scots, exchanged passionate correspondence with her husbands and suitors, blending personal desire with political strategy. Philip II of Spain wrote to his distant bride, Mary I of England, pledging loyalty even as political storms threatened their fragile union. These courtships remind us that royal love was rarely simple. Every letter carried double-weight romantic longing and political calculation. A phrase of affection could reassure a lover while also signaling loyalty to a faction. A promise of marriage could warm a heart while simultaneously shaping the fate of nations. What sets these famous stories apart is how human they feel despite their royal context. Henry VIII may have been a king, but in his letters, he was simply a man in love, begging for replies, fearing rejection, and clinging to promises. Mary, Queen of Scots, may have been a queen, but in her letters, she was a young woman, struggling to balance duty with passion. These famous long-distance romances reveal a truth that transcends time. Even when crowns weighed heavily, love still spoke in whispers, in ink, and in the fragile hope that distance could be conquered by devotion. In the 1500s, royal love was never just about hearts. It was also about crowns, armies, and the fate of kingdoms. A royal romance, especially one lived at a distance, could tip the scales of power across Europe. In this sense, love itself became a political weapon. When a king or queen wrote letters of affection, the words were rarely private. Courtiers intercepted them, diplomats analyzed them, and enemies used them as evidence of weakness or manipulation. Every whisper of love had consequences. For royals, passion could strengthen alliances or destroy them. Consider the marriage negotiations of Mary Tudor, Queen of England, to Philip II of Spain. Their union in 1554 was not born of desire but of political strategy, designed to strengthen Catholic ties across Europe. Yet, while Mary was deeply devoted to Philip, he remained often absent, governing his vast empire. Their long-distance marriage created both political unity and personal sorrow. Mary's love for Philip was so strong that his coldness and distance left her heartbroken. While their marriage sparked unrest in England, where many resented foreign influence, love, in this case, became both a tool and a burden. Or take Mary, Queen of Scots, whose life was defined by letters of love that doubled as instruments of power. Her correspondence with the Earl of Bothwell, her third husband, became scandalous, fueling accusations of conspiracy and murder. Whether authentic or forged, these letters show how dangerous long-distance communication could be for a queen. Passion was not just private, it was political ammunition. Even arranged marriages, conducted across borders, carried this double meaning. A royal bride sent to another kingdom was a symbol of trust between nations. Her letters home reassured her family of her loyalty, while her letters to her husband reassured him of her devotion. Yet, these same letters could be scrutinized for hints of betrayal, rebellion, or foreign influence. Love became a battlefield of ink. What makes royal love stories of the 1500s so fascinating is how they blurred the line between intimacy and diplomacy. A kiss sealed more than affectionate sealed treaties. A promise whispered before departure was also a promise to armies, merchants, and subjects. Distance magnified this tension, as letters carried both longing and strategy. And yet, despite the politics, genuine love sometimes emerged. Couples like Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn remind us that passion could defy strategy even at the highest levels. But when passion clashed with politics, the results could be catastrophic. Anne lost her head, Mary lost her throne, Mary Tudor lost her heart. In all these stories, Love at a distance was not simply a matter of longing, it was a matter of survival. Ultimately, the royal romances of the 1500s revealed that long-distance love was not confined to villagers and soldiers' wives. It played out in castles and palaces, shaping the very course of history. The written word of a king or queen carried more than emotion, it carried power. Because, in that age, to love across distance was not only to risk heartbreak, it was to risk kingdoms. The 1500s were not only an age of kings and wars, but also an age of trade. Merchants became the lifeblood of expanding cities and rising empires, carrying goods across seas and continents. But for every merchant who set sail, there was often a wife for a lover left behind, facing months or years of absence. Unlike soldiers who marched away at the command of kings, merchants left home in pursuit of profit. Their journeys took them to ports in the Mediterranean, the Baltic, Africa, and, increasingly, the newly reached Americas and Asia. The expansion of trade routes promised wealth, but it also demanded distance. And that distance shaped countless marriages and relationships. For the merchant himself, travel was both adventure and risk. He might return with ships laden with spices, silks, or precious metals, elevating his family's fortunes. Or he might never return at all, claimed by storms, piracy, or disease in foreign ports. The uncertainty of his fate made every departure a gamble, not only with wealth, but with love. For his wife, the merchant's absence was a heavy burden. She was left to manage the household, care for children, and protect property in a world where women had little formal power. In prosperous merchant families, wives often became de facto managers of the business, handling debts, rents, and even negotiations while their husbands were away. Letters reveal that many wives were sharp businesswomen, balancing survival with loyalty. But behind the ledgers, there was always longing. Love at a distance for these couples was shaped by trade itself. A merchant's letter home might describe profits, risks, and markets, but also include tender words for his wife, assurances of love, and promises of return. These letters carried both business and intimacy, because the two were inseparable. His success abroad determined her security at home. Yet distance was not kind to affection. Months without word could breed doubt. Rumors traveled of sailors keeping mistresses in foreign ports, of merchants entangled with exotic temptations abroad. Some women endured these whispers with stoic patience. Others broke under the silence. Trust was stretched as thin as the sails of the ships that carried their husbands away. And yet, devotion endured. Wives clung to tokens, left behind rings, garments, portraits, just as sailors carried tokens of their families. These objects became emotional anchors, proof that love existed across miles of sea. In many ways, the merchant's marriage was a partnership of endurance. She kept the household alive. He sought fortune abroad, and both hoped the other remained faithful. The figure of the merchant's wife became symbolic in 1500s literature and songs. She was often portrayed as patient, loyal, and strong, a woman who bore solitude with dignity. But she was also portrayed, at times, as vulnerable, tempted in her husband's absence, or accused of infidelity. These contrasting images reflected society's anxieties about long-distance relationships, admiration for loyalty, suspicion of betrayal. What made the merchantess marriage unique was how it revealed the new global world of the 1500s. Love was no longer confined to villages or courts. It now stretched across oceans, shaped by commerce and exploration. The bond between merchant and wife was, in many ways, the first form of globalized love, tested not just by distance, but by the vastness of the world itself. In the end, the merchant's wife embodied the resilience required of long-distance relationships in the 1500s. Her life was a balance of duty, faith, and waiting. And her story reminds us that while trade brought wealth to Europe, it also brought loneliness to countless homes. If the merchant's journey was long, dangerous, and uncertain, then his letter was even more so. In the 1500s, when oceans separated husbands from wives, a single piece of parchment carried across the seas became the only bridge between two worlds. Unlike letters exchanged across kingdoms, overseas correspondence faced almost impossible odds. A message written in London might need to cross the Atlantic to the Caribbean or the Mediterranean to the Levant. Ships were slow, unpredictable, and constantly at risk. A storm could drown hundreds of letters in an instant. Pirates could seize cargo, including correspondence. Even when ships arrived safely, ports often delayed or misplaced deliveries. For every letter that arrived, dozens were lost. This scarcity gave oceanic letters immense value. A wife receiving a message from her husband abroad might hold it as if it were treasure. The parchment, worn by salt air and weeks of travel, carried not only ink but the very presence of the one she loved. She might read and reread it until the words blurred, memorizing every sentence, carrying the letter with her like a relic. In the silence of absence, this fragile paper became proof of survival. The content of such letters often reflected the dual burdens merchants carried. A typical letter might open with declarations of love and longing, assurances of fidelity, blessings upon children, promises of return. But soon it would turn to business prices of spices, the state of markets, debts owed, and risks of storms or disease. In this way, the letters were hybrids of intimacy and commerce, binding the household together through both affection and survival. For the wives left behind, writing back was just as challenging. Not only was literacy uneven, but sending a letter overseas required access to ships, captains, and trusted couriers. A woman might have to beg a merchant or sailor heading abroad to carry her words. And she had to trust that her letter would be delivered, intact, months later, to a husband waiting in some distant port. Writing itself was an act of hope, with no guarantee of an answer. This uncertainty shaped the very tone of oceanic love letters. Many were filled with urgency. Write to me when you can, for I live in agony not knowing your state. Others were almost desperate prayers. God keep you safe and bring you home to me, for my heart cannot bear the silence. Silence, indeed, was the greatest torment. A wife might wait 6 months for a reply, only to receive nothing. Was her husband alive? Was he lost at sea? Was he faithless? With no word, she could only endure. And yet, the act of writing and waiting became part of the devotion. To write a letter across oceans in the 1500s was to make a declaration of faith. I believe in you enough to trust that these words will reach you, no matter the distance, no matter the danger. It was an act of love, wrapped in courage. Over time, these letters became symbols of endurance in literature and folklore. Songs spoke of sailors' wives waiting at the shore, clinging to parchment stained with salt. Poems praised the loyalty of women who endured years of silence, their only comfort the fragile hope of a letter's arrival. Letters sent across oceans were fragile, rare, and uncertain, but when they arrived, they carried more weight than any modern message could. For in that age, a letter was not just communication, it was survival. It was proof. It was love itself, carried on the waves. For every merchant who left his homeland in the 1500s, there was someone waiting. A wife, a lover, left behind with little more than a promise and a token. And in that waiting, entire lives were shaped. The loneliness of the merchant's wife was not just emotional, it was practical. She was often left in charge of a household, fields, shops, or tenants. Merchants traveled for profit, but their absence created an emptiness at home. Wives balanced ledgers, collected debts, negotiated with suppliers, and managed servants. These responsibilities gave them a kind of authority unusual for women of the time. Yet, alongside that authority came crushing isolation. A wife might spend her mornings dealing with business and her evenings staring at the horizon, wondering if her husband's ship had survived the storms. Every knock at the door carried a jolt of fear. Was this the letter she had prayed for, or the news she dreaded? For women who could not read, the loneliness was deeper still. Even if a letter arrived, she needed a priest, scribe, or trusted neighbor to read it. The intimacy of love was filtered through another person's voice. Imagine hearing your husband's declaration of love spoken aloud by someone else, while you sit silently, hands trembling. The words reached your ears, but not in his voice. Loneliness also came with suspicion. The longer a merchant stayed away, the louder the whispers grew. Neighbors speculated, has he found another woman in a foreign port? Will he ever return? Some wives faced pressure to remarry, especially if they were left without money. Others faced accusations of unfaithfulness, simply because they lived without their husbands. Distance bred doubt, and doubt could poison love as surely as absence did. The merchant's wife endured this loneliness with rituals of faith. Many turned to prayer, visiting churches daily, lighting candles for their husband's safe return. Others clung to tokens: a ring, a piece of clothing, a lock of hair. These objects became substitutes for presents, held against the heart in moments of despair. Some women even developed habits of writing letters they could never send, filling pages with words of longing, then storing them in chests as private confessions. Loneliness also left its mark on culture. In folk songs and ballads of the 1500's, the figure of the waiting wife appears again and again. She is portrayed sitting by the window, looking at the sea, her hands idle but her heart restless. Sometimes her lover returns, and the story ends in joy. More often, he does not, and the song becomes an elegy of loss. These stories reflected the reality of countless women across Europe, whose lives were defined not by presence, but by waiting. Yet, within this loneliness lay a strange strength. The merchant's wife became a symbol of endurance, of loyalty under pressure. Her patience was seen as a virtue, her suffering as proof of love. In communities where everyone knew the pain of separation, whether through war, trade, or marriage, her waiting became almost heroic. The loneliness of waiting was not chosen, it was endured. And that endurance gave it meaning. To remain faithful across months or years of silence was not simply a matter of affection. It was a daily act of courage, a defiance of despair. In this way, the merchant's wife embodies the essence of long-distance love in the 1500's. Her story is not just about absence, it is about resilience. It is about the ability of the heart to endure silence, to believe in promises, to hold on to love when the world offers no guarantee of reunion. Because, in an age of risk and distance, waiting was not weakness. Waiting was strength. The 1500's were not only a time of voyages and trade, but also of religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation fractured Europe. The Ottoman Empire expanded into Christian lands, and Catholic and Protestant kingdoms eyed each other with suspicion. In this divided world, love across faiths was one of the most dangerous and most distant forms of devotion. For Christians and Muslims living at the edges of empires, interfaith romances were whispered about, often condemned, but never entirely prevented. A Venetian merchant might fall in love with a woman in Constantinople, or a Christian captive might bond with a Muslim household. These relationships were shadowed by cultural and religious distance, but also by physical separation. Letters, if exchanged at all, had to cross hostile borders, risking interception and punishment. Within Europe, the Reformation created another kind of distance. Lovers were sometimes divided not by geography, but by confession. A Catholic woman in France might fall in love with a Protestant man, only to see her family forbid the union. A Lutheran merchant might marry across borders, leaving his Catholic wife behind. Their relationship stretched across letters, colored with both affection and theological tension. Religion shaped love at every step. Marriage was not simply a personal choice, it was a sacred bond defined by the Church. To love across faiths was to risk damnation, exile, or dishonor. In many cases, couples were forced apart, not by lack of devotion, but by pressure from priests, parents, and political authorities. Distance became not only physical, but spiritual. And yet, forbidden love often burned the brightest. Letters from the period sometimes show coded references to faith, where lovers reassured each other that love was stronger than doctrine. A Catholic might write to a Protestant partner with lines that blended biblical imagery and personal longing, turning scripture into metaphor for devotion. These words carried double meaning, promises of love hidden beneath layers of faith. But the danger was real. In Catholic Spain, interfaith relationships with Muslims or Jews could lead to denunciation before the Inquisition. In Protestant England, Catholic sympathizers were watched closely, their loyalties suspect. To send or receive a love letter across these divides was not only an act of romance, it was an act of rebellion. Distance magnified the pain of such love. Lovers who could not openly meet relied on secret couriers, concealed notes, or messages disguised as business correspondence. Absence was already heavy in the 1500s, but when layered with religious taboo, it became nearly unbearable. For many, the only option was to choose faith over love, or to cling to love in silence, carrying longing like a secret prayer. These stories of love across faiths remind us that distance in the 1500s was not just measured in miles. It was measured in belief, in doctrine, in walls built by religion. To love across those walls was to risk everything. And yet, some did. Their devotion crossed not only geography, but eternity itself. In the 1500s, faith was not just a belief, it was a way of life. People prayed daily, attended Mass or services weekly, and measured their years by feast days and fasts. One of the most powerful expressions of devotion was the pilgrimage, a journey made to holy sites in search of healing, forgiveness, or spiritual renewal. But for those in love, a pilgrimage also meant separation. Unlike war or trade, which were often forced upon people, pilgrimages were sometimes chosen. A man or woman might set out on the road to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, to Canterbury in England before its suppression under Henry VIII, or even to Rome itself. These journeys could last months or longer, depending on distance. For couples, it meant parting not for money or politics, but for God. The emotional complexity of this separation was profound. On the one hand, pilgrimage was seen as noble, a sacred duty. To question it was to question faith itself. Yet on the other hand, for a wife left behind or awaiting at home, the absence was still absence. Love was tested not by seas or swords, but by sanctity. Letters from pilgrims, when they could be sent, often blended piety with affection. A man walking to Rome might write of relics and shrines he visited, but also assure his beloved that he prayed for her at every altar. A wife at home might respond with words of longing, asking God to protect her husband's journey and bring him safely back. Their love became intertwined with devotion, every absence framed as a sacrifice offered to heaven. For some, however, pilgrimage was a wedge that widened the distance beyond repair. A man might leave for a holy journey and never return, claimed by illness, robbery, or simply choosing a new life far from home. For the partner left behind, the uncertainty was devastating. Was he alive? Was he faithful? Would God ever answer her prayers for his return? In an age without fast communication, such questions often lingered for years. There were also cases where pilgrimage became an excuse for escape. A man or woman dissatisfied with marriage might declare a holy purpose and vanish on the road, leaving the other to endure a different kind of distance. Abandonment cloaked in piety. Society usually accepted such departures, since pilgrimage was seen as spiritually legitimate. But for the one left behind, faith could not erase betrayal. Still, for many couples, pilgrimage deepened their love rather than weakened it. The very act of waiting became a kind of prayer, proof of patience and fidelity. Some wives lit candles daily for their absent husbands, marking each passing week with ritual. Some husbands carried tokens of their wives on the road, pressing them against relics as if to unite earthly love with heavenly blessing. The poetry and songs of the age reflect this union of faith and romance. Pilgrims in verse often spoke not only to God but also to absent lovers, blending sacred vows with human devotion. To walk for miles in silence was to meditate not only on heaven, but on the one left behind. In this way, love itself became a pilgrimage, an act of endurance, sacrifice, and hope for reunion. Pilgrimages remind us that distance in the 1500s was not always imposed by war or trade. Sometimes it was chosen freely, even joyfully, yet still carried the same burden of absence. For the couples who endured it, love was tested not against the world's dangers, but against the soul's longing. Because to love someone on pilgrimage was to wait with faith, not only in God, but in each other. In the 1500s, religion governed not only how people prayed, but how they loved. The church defined marriage, enforced morality, and judged fidelity. This meant that some forms of correspondence between lovers were not only frowned upon, but outright forbidden. And yet, in the shadows of faith, letters still traveled, dangerous, secret, and filled with longing. One of the most forbidden forms of correspondence was between members of different faiths. A Catholic writing to a Protestant during the Reformation risked not only scandal, but persecution. Families might discover the letters and denounce the lovers to authorities. Priests or ministers could condemn them from the pulpit. In an age where faith was tied to loyalty, a letter of love could be mistaken for treason. The same was true in lands divided between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. In Spain, after the Reconquista, correspondence between a Christian and a Muslim or Jewish lover could lead to charges before the Inquisition. Letters in such cases had to be carefully disguised, often written in metaphors, poetry, or code. A simple mention of a flower, a season, or a psalm might hold secret meaning, decipherable only to the two hearts involved. Even within the same faith, correspondence could be forbidden when it violated vows of celibacy. Monks, priests, and nuns were sworn to God, not to earthly romance. Yet history preserves stories of letters exchanged between cloistered women and men beyond the convent walls, hidden under food baskets or tucked inside prayer books. Such letters were perilous. Discovery could mean punishment, exile, or even death. But to the writers, silence was worse than risk. For young people, forbidden correspondence often took place within their own families. A daughter promised to one man might secretly write to another. Parents arranged marriages based on wealth and alliances, not love. So letters of affection outside the contract were seen as rebellion. Some families employed servants or priests to monitor correspondence, intercepting letters before they reached their destination. This only made the act of sending them more thrilling and more dangerous. The tension between faith and passion gave these letters a unique character. They were often short, urgent, and written in careful disguise. Lovers might hide their feelings under religious language. "I pray for you daily" could mean "I long for you constantly." Passages from the Psalms or Song of Songs became love poems in disguise. Scripture itself became a secret code of desire. But forbidden correspondence was not only romantic, it was also symbolic. It represented defiance against structures that tried to control love. Each letter carried across hidden channels was proof that devotion could survive silence, distance, and threat. It was love against law, intimacy against authority. The risk of discovery gave these exchanges an intensity that ordinary letters lacked. Every seal broken in secret, every word read by candlelight carried the thrill of danger. To write was an act of courage. To receive was an act of trust. And to keep such letters hidden was an act of faith, not just in God, but in each other. Of course, many were caught. Letters exposed in trials before inquisitors or family councils often became evidence against lovers. In some cases, the very words meant to unite two hearts were the instruments of their downfall. Yet even in failure, these forbidden letters reveal the depth of human longing in the 1500s. They show us that, in a world ruled by religion, love still found ways to speak quietly, secretly, but persistently. In the end, forbidden correspondence was both a tragedy and a triumph. A tragedy because so many lovers paid the price of discovery. A triumph because their words prove that love, however dangerous, could not be silenced. In the 1500s, the written word was power. To write was to preserve thought, to claim authority, to leave a mark on the world. Yet literacy was far from universal. For women, it was even rarer. In most of Europe, fewer than 1 in 10 women could read or write, and yet, in matters of love and distance, women's voices still found a way to reach across time and space. Among the nobility, literacy was more common. Noble women were often educated, not just in household management, but also in letters, music, and sometimes classical literature. A well-born woman might be fluent in French, Latin, or Italian, able to compose poetry, prayers, and letters. For her, long-distance love could take the form of eloquent correspondence, filled with metaphors of roses and stars, biblical allusions, and carefully measured words that both concealed and revealed her feelings. But even for educated women, writing love letters was risky. In many noble households, correspondence was monitored by fathers, brothers, or husbands. A woman's private words could be intercepted and used against her. Yet this did not silence her. Instead, she developed strategies. She wrote in riddles, hiding love behind layers of poetry. She used metaphors of nature seasons, storms, or birds migrating to express longing without openly declaring it. A line about the winter's cold might mean your absence freezes me. A reference to spring's return might mean I wait for you to come back. For women of lower classes, literacy was far less accessible. Most could not write their own letters, but this did not erase their voices. Many turned to priests, scribes, or literate neighbors, dictating words of love and longing. Of course, This demanded immense vulnerability. To entrust a stranger with one's most intimate emotions was both humiliating and dangerous. Privacy evaporated the moment another hand touched the quill. Yet women accepted this risk because silence was worse. Sometimes, women found creative ways to overcome illiteracy. They sent objects as messages. A ribbon knotted in a certain way, a flower pressed into cloth, or a small token that carried unspoken meaning. These gestures became a language of their own, a silent form of correspondence that could bypass the watchful eyes of family or clergy. What is striking about female voices in long-distance love during the 1500s is their resilience. Even in a world that denied them education, denied them autonomy, denied them choice in marriage, women found ways to speak. Their letters, whether penned by their own hand or dictated to another, reveal longing, wit, devotion, and strength. For the women who could write, the letter was a weapon as much as a comfort. A well-written letter could soften an absent husband, remind him of duty, or stir his affection. For those who could not, the very act of dictating their feelings proved their determination to be heard. Long-distance love in the 1500s was never easy. But for women, it carried an extra challenge. Not only the pain of absence, but the struggle to make their voices travel across miles in a world that often silenced them. That they succeeded at all is a testament to the power of love and the ingenuity of those determined to express it. In the 1500s, a woman's words were rarely her own. Letters might be read by fathers, brothers, or even servants before reaching their intended recipient. Privacy, especially for women, was almost impossible. And yet, this did not prevent them from expressing love across distance. Instead, it forced them to invent new ways of speaking. Out of necessity, codes and secret languages blossomed. Some codes were simple. Lovers used metaphors so ordinary that outsiders would dismiss them as harmless. A mention of the garden might mean a private meeting place. A reference to health could disguise affection. I pray for your good health might secretly mean I long for your touch. Even scripture could be transformed into hidden dialogue. Passages from the Song of Songs, filled with poetic imagery of desire, were copied into letters, as though they were prayers. But the true readers understood them as declarations of love. Other codes were more deliberate. Some women devised alphabets of symbols, replacing letters with shapes or marks known only to them and their lovers. Others wrote with deliberate spelling errors or unusual phrasing, embedding hidden meaning between the lines. What looked like clumsy handwriting to outsiders was, in fact, a careful disguise. Tokens also became codes. A flower tucked into a folded letter might carry specific meaning. A red rose for passion, rosemary for remembrance, violets for loyalty. A lock of hair, a ribbon knotted in a certain way, or even the color of thread used to stitch a handkerchief could all speak louder than ink. These physical codes were harder to intercept because only the intended lover could truly read their meaning. Women also used music and poetry as shields. A song sung in public might appear to be a ballad of faith or folklore, but between two people, its verses carried hidden promises. A poem exchanged at a festival might seem like harmless art, but its rhyme scheme held a secret message. The very creativity of the Renaissance gave women tools to conceal love in plain sight. This secrecy was not only about romance, it was about survival. For women, exposure could mean disgrace, punishment, or exile. A discovered letter might ruin a reputation forever. Families controlled marriages fiercely, and any hint of disobedience could bring shame. Codes, therefore, were not games of wit but shields against ruin. Yet, secrecy added its own intensity to long-distance love. A woman who slipped a coded phrase into a letter knew that her lover would search for its hidden meaning. The act of decoding became intimate, a private ritual of connection that no outsider could touch. Each exchange deepened the bond, because the very act of secrecy proved devotion. These hidden voices remind us that women in the 1500s were not silent, even when the world tried to silence them. They whispered through metaphors, sang through ballads, and stitched their hearts into fabric. Their ingenuity transformed distance into dialogue, and oppression into creativity. The beauty of these codes is that they survive, even today, preserved in letters, poems, and songs from the period. To modern eyes, they may seem innocent, but to those who lived them, they were lifelines, fragments of the soul disguised as ordinary words. In this way, women turned constraint into expression. By creating secret codes, they ensured that love could travel across miles, across silence, and even across the watchful eyes of those who sought to keep them voiceless. In the 1500s, long-distance relationships weighed heavily on both men and women. But for women, the burden was often greater. Society demanded that they wait, endure, and remain faithful, while offering them little freedom or comfort in return. Their lives became a constant negotiation between love, duty, and survival. When husbands, lovers, or betrothed men left for war, trade, or pilgrimage, women were expected to stay behind as guardians of loyalty. Communities admired a faithful wife, yet condemned a woman who moved on too quickly after absence or silence. Men could return from years abroad and expect to find their partners waiting. Women had no such expectation of reciprocity. If they faltered, even under unbearable loneliness, they faced harsh judgment. The emotional burden of waiting was profound. A woman might rise each day to run her household, but every task was shadowed by uncertainty. Was her husband alive? Would her lover ever return? Was she wasting her youth, waiting for someone claimed by war or sea? With no reliable news, she lived suspended between hope and despair, her emotions stretched as thin as the miles that separated them. Loneliness was amplified by silence. For literate women, letters might offer occasional reprieve, but months could pass without word, and each day without news fed anxiety. For illiterate women, silence was nearly total, broken only by rumors, gossip, or official notices. To wait without words was to live in a void, filling the absence with imaginations sometimes comforting, often torturous. This burden was also social. Families placed responsibility on women to preserve honor while men were away. A wife whose husband traveled was expected not only to remain faithful, but to defend his reputation in his absence. Neighbors watched her, speculating about her behavior. Even friendly interactions with other men could spark suspicion. In this sense, women lived under constant surveillance, their fidelity policed by society as much as by personal conscience. For unmarried women, the burden was even heavier. A betrothed girl who's left for war or trade might wait years without certainty of marriage. If he died, she could be left dishonored, her prospects ruined. If he returned, her loyalty would be praised, but the years lost could never be regained. The cost of devotion was often borne more by women than by men, and yet women endured. They found strength in rituals of patience, lighting candles, whispering prayers, treasuring tokens left behind. Many carried on with resilience, raising children, managing homes, and sustaining communities while their men were absent. Their emotional burden was heavy, but it was also transformative. It forced them into roles of responsibility, gave them authority in households, and proved their capacity for endurance. The burden of distance also inspired creativity. Women poured their emotions into songs, poems, embroidery, and oral stories. Folk ballads often told of wives waiting by windows, daughters longing for absent lovers, and promises made before departure. These were not just artistic expressions, they were outlets for emotional survival. Ways to give voice to what society often silenced. In the end, the emotional burden on women in the 1500s reveals a deep imbalance. Men traveled, fought, and traded, carrying the risks of danger. But women carried the risks of absence, loneliness, dishonor, and the endless uncertainty of waiting. Their devotion was praised, but their suffering was often invisible. And yet, this burden also reveals their strength. Women were not merely passive figures in long-distance love stories. They were active participants in endurance. They kept households alive, they preserved family honor, and they sustained love across impossible distances. Their stories remind us that long-distance love in the 1500s was not only about letters, wars, or voyages. It was also about women who carried the heaviest weight, the emotional cost of waiting in silence, and the courage to endure it. In the 1500s, letters were the fragile lifelines of long-distance love, but they were also vulnerable. Every message that left the writer's hands entered a world of risk, theft, interception, or betrayal. For lovers separated by miles, the greatest danger was not always silence, it was the wrong eyes discovering their words. Unlike today's private messages, letters in the 16th century passed through many hands. A courier, a servant, a soldier, even a stranger encountered on the road might carry them. Each of these people had the opportunity to break a seal, to peek at the words inside. And when those words were declarations of love, they could spark scandal, ruin, or even violence. For noble families, intercepted letters were often tools of control. A daughter secretly writing to a forbidden lover could see her letter opened by her father or brothers. The discovery could lead to punishment, confinement, or forced marriage elsewhere. A nobleman whose wife's letters were intercepted might accuse her of dishonor, even if the words were innocent. In courts where alliances were fragile, a single letter could destroy reputations overnight. Among common people, the risks were different but no less real. Gossip traveled faster than parchment. If a woman's letter to a soldier abroad was read by neighbors, whispers could brand her unfaithful or desperate. A man's words of affection, intercepted by rivals, could be mocked or twisted against him. In small communities where everyone knew each other, privacy was nearly impossible. The political world added another layer of danger. Across Europe, religious and royal authorities monitored correspondence for signs of heresy, treason, or conspiracy. Love letters, innocent in intention, could be mistaken for secret codes. A phrase about eternal loyalty might be interpreted as political allegiance. A poem of longing could be read as hidden rebellion. In Spain, the Inquisition sometimes examined private letters for evidence of forbidden relationships, whether romantic or interfaith. In such cases, love itself became incriminating. To guard against these risks, lovers invented strategies. Seals bore personal marks, proving authenticity. Codes and metaphors hid feelings in plain sight. But even these could fail if intercepted. Some letters from the 1500s survive only because they were confiscated, stored in archives, as evidence rather than delivered to their intended readers. They reveal the raw intimacy of passion, frozen forever in the hands of those who were never meant to see them. For the writers, the fear of interception shaped their words. Love letters often balanced tenderness with caution, leaving feelings implied rather than explicit. A lover might write, "I long for the day we walk in the garden again," knowing that to outsiders this seemed harmless, but to the recipient it carried hidden meaning. Entire romances survived on suggestion and restraint, their passion filtered through the fear of discovery, and when letters were intercepted deliberately by jealous rivals or suspicious families, the results could be catastrophic. Some lovers were separated forever, accused of dishonor. Others were forced into marriages against their will. In extreme cases, accusations of adultery or betrayal, supported by intercepted letters, led to imprisonment or even execution. The fragility of letters in the 1500s reminds us of the immense courage it took to write them at all. Every sealed parchment sent across distance was a gamble. Would it reach the beloved's hands or become a weapon against them both? This danger gave long-distance love a sharp edge. Affection was not only an act of devotion, but an act of risk. To entrust one's heart to parchment was to accept the possibility that the world might use it against you. And yet, lovers wrote anyway. Because, for them, silence was worse than betrayal. Distance has always tested love. In the 1500s, when months or even years could pass without word from a partner, that test was far harsher than today. Long-distance relationships of the age carried not only the pain of absence, but also the gnawing fear of betrayal. For women left behind, suspicion was constant. Communities often watched widows and wives of absent men with sharp eyes, quick to judge any behavior that hinted at infidelity. A woman might simply speak kindly to a neighbor or accept help from another man, and rumors would spread. While she waited faithfully, society doubted her loyalty, and whispers could ruin her reputation. The burden of proving fidelity fell almost entirely on women, who lived under the gaze of family, church, and community. For men, abroad, soldiers, sailors, or merchants, the temptations were different. Separated from home, many were accused of forming attachments with women in foreign lands. Soldiers were notorious for taking lovers during campaigns, and sailors for leaving behind children in distant ports. While some of these stories were true, many were exaggerated or fueled by gossip. Yet, for the wife or lover waiting at home, the uncertainty was torture. Silence left space for doubt, and doubt grew like a shadow. Infidelity was not always physical. Emotional betrayal could cut just as deeply. Letters sometimes reveal men or women who confessed their loneliness by writing to others for comfort. A woman might turn to a childhood friend, a man to a fellow soldier's sister. These connections, born of isolation, were often small sparks that threatened to ignite into scandal if discovered. Religion magnified the stakes. The church taught that fidelity was sacred, and adultery a grave sin. Couples separated by distance were expected to remain pure, no matter how long the absence lasted. To falter was not only a personal failure, but a spiritual one. Confessors heard countless admissions of weakness, both from those who strayed and those who doubted their partner's loyalty. And yet, infidelity was also a survival strategy. A woman left without support by a husband, gone to war or lost at sea, might turn to another man for protection. A soldier who believed he would never return might comfort himself in the arms of a camp follower. These choices, judged harshly by society, were often born of desperation. Love was fragile in the face of hunger, loneliness, and fear. Trust, therefore, became the foundation of long-distance love in the 1500s. Without daily reassurances, couples relied on vows spoken before departure, on tokens exchanged, and on letters that served as proof of devotion. But even these could not silence doubt. A missing letter, a delayed reply, a rumor from a travel-age, could spark suspicion. Some couples endured, their faith unshaken by distance. Others fractured, broken by whispers or temptation. What separated them was not just loyalty, but resilience, the ability to endure absence without letting fear become betrayal. The risk of infidelity was ever present because distance in the 1500s was not just physical. It was emotional, social, and spiritual. To remain faithful was to resist loneliness, resist gossip, and resist the very human desire for comfort in another's arms. It was to hold fast to hope when silence felt like abandonment. This is why the risk of betrayal weighed so heavily on long-distance relationships of the age. Because every mile apart was not only a measure of love, but a test of loyalty. And for those who passed that test, fidelity was not casual, it was heroic. In today's world, a long-distance partner can be reached instantly. Messages fly across oceans in seconds, offering constant reassurance. But in the 1500s, lovers had no such lifeline. Weeks, months, sometimes years passed without a single word. In that silence, trust became the fragile thread holding relationships together. Trust in the 1500s was not built on frequent reminders, but on memory and faith. A woman waiting for her husband's return from war clung to his last words before departure, repeating them like a prayer. A sailor's wife might keep his ring or his shirt by her bedside, not only as a token of love, but as a reminder of her promise to wait. Every object carried weight, every vow echoed in absence. But silence was a cruel companion. Without news, imagination filled the void. Was he alive? Was she faithful? Had he been lost to war, the sea, or the plague? Had she given her heart to another? Each unanswered question gnawed at the bond, demanding a level of trust that few today can fathom. This trust was tested not only by distance, but by society. Neighbors whispered doubts, families questioned loyalties, and rival suitors saw opportunities. A woman left behind might hear gossip that her lover abroad had taken another. A man returning from years of service might face rumors that his wife had been unfaithful. In such a world, trust had to be fierce, strong enough to resist both silence and slander. Religion played a role here as well. The church framed fidelity as a sacred duty. To trust one's partner was to honor not only them, but God. Couples were reminded that absence was a test of faith, and that true love would endure it. Yet faith and trust are not the same. Faith looks to God. Trust looks to a human heart that can falter. Balancing the two was part of the emotional burden of long-distance love. For many, the act of writing letters was itself an exercise in trust. Sending words across dangerous roads or seas meant believing not only that they would arrive, but that the recipient would treasure them faithfully. The risk of interception, loss, or delay was high, yet people still entrusted their deepest feelings to fragile parchment. Each letter was a gamble of love and a testament to belief in the other's loyalty. When trust endured, it transformed relationships. Couples who reunited after years of silence often described their love as stronger, purified by distance. They had endured gossip, loneliness, and doubt, yet remained faithful. For them, trust was not just an idea, it was proof of devotion, stronger than absence. But when trust failed, the collapse was swift. Accusations of betrayal could shatter reputations, marriages, and entire families. In courts of law, intercepted letters or rumors of infidelity were enough to dissolve unions. Trust was fragile because silence gave no defense. In the absence of proof, suspicion often triumphed over faith. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of love in the 1500s is that so many chose to trust anyway, despite the silence, despite the dangers, despite the risks of betrayal. Countless men and women held fast to promises made before parting. They waited, they endured, and they believed. Trust, in the age of silence, was not naive. It was brave. It was the choice to believe in another heart across miles of uncertainty when the world offered every reason to doubt. This is what made long-distance love in the 1500s extraordinary. Not the silence itself, but the courage it demanded to believe that love could outlast it. In the 1500s, when distance made direct contact rare, poetry became one of the most powerful ways to bridge absence. For lovers separated by oceans, wars, or family duty, verse allowed them to transform longing into art. Love poetry in the Renaissance was not only about beauty, was about survival. This was the age of courtly love traditions, inherited from the Middle Ages but reshaped by Renaissance humanism. Poets wrote of knights pining for distant ladies, of unattainable women compared to stars, roses, or angels. These themes resonated with men and women living in real separation because poetry mirrored their struggles. To compare an absent lover to the sun or moon was more than a metaphor. It was an attempt to capture the pain of distance in imagery everyone could understand. Across Europe, poets poured their emotions into verse. In England, Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, introduced sonnets modelled after Petrarch, whose 14th century laments for the distant Laura still echoed in the 1500s. Their poems spoke of love as both torment and ecstasy, where absence sharpened desire. In Italy, Petrarch's legacy was alive and well, shaping generations of writers who viewed longing as the purest form of passion. In Spain and France, poets likewise used love poetry as a way to elevate absence into something noble, almost sacred. But poetry was not confined to elites. Folk songs and ballads carried the voices of ordinary men and women separated by distance. A peasant girl might sing of her lover gone to sea. Her words passed from village to village, echoing the shared pain of waiting. These songs often blurred the line between art and confession, serving both as entertainment and emotional release. In them, love was not abstract. It was raw, filled with tears, prayers, and longing. For women especially, poetry offered a way to speak when society silenced them. Educated noble women wrote verses, expressing longing for absent husbands or forbidden lovers. Their words, though carefully veiled, gave voice to feelings they could not express openly. Even illiterate women participated by dictating verses to scribes, weaving their emotions into rhyme. Poetry became a form of coded resistance, allowing women to speak of desire under the guise of art. Poetry also gave permanence to love in an age of uncertainty. Letters could be lost, but a copied poem might survive in manuscripts, shared among friends, or preserved in libraries. Some lovers wrote poems instead of prose letters, knowing that verse carried an air of dignity that might protect it from scandal. To receive a poem was to receive not only words of devotion, but art itself, a treasure worthy of rereading endlessly. The language of love poetry in the 1500s reveals how deeply distance shaped relationships. Lovers wrote of oceans as barriers, of time as an enemy, of the beloved as a guiding star. Their metaphors carried the weight of real absence, transforming separation into imagery that could endure. In the end, poetry was not just an artistic flourish. It was the heartbeat of long-distance love. For those who could not touch, poetry allowed them to imagine. For those who could not speak, poetry allowed them to whisper. For those who feared love might fade in silence, poetry preserved it in ink and song. Love poetry of the 1500s reminds us that art was not separate from life. It was life itself, woven out of longing, distance, and devotion. The roots of long-distance love in the 1500s reached deep into the tradition of courtly love, a cultural movement that began centuries earlier but still shaped Renaissance romance. Courtly love was an idealized vision of passion, a knight devoted entirely to a lady, often unattainable, often distant, serving her with loyalty, suffering, and song. By the 16th century, this tradition continued to influence how people thought, wrote, and lived their loves, especially loves separated by distance. In its classic form, courtly love framed longing as the purest form of devotion. Lovers were meant to suffer, to wait, to endure absence without complaint. The more unattainable the beloved, the nobler the passion. This idea resonated deeply in an age when marriages were arranged, wars tore couples apart, and oceans divided husbands and wives. For those enduring separation, courtly love offered a kind of dignity to their pain. The language of courtly love became a cultural shorthand. Poets and letter writers compared absent lovers to stars guiding ships, to roses blooming in winter, to angels whose beauty transcended earthly distance. These metaphors were not just pretty, they carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Instantly recognizable to readers of the time, a single reference to a knight's devotion or a lady's coldness could conjure the entire framework of courtly longing. For men, courtly love often meant positioning themselves as servants of their beloved, even if separated by miles. Letters sometimes adopted the tone of supplication. "I am your humble knight, bound to you though the seas divide us." For women, especially noble women, courtly love gave a rare opportunity to exercise power. A lady could be adored from afar, her absence magnifying her influence. Her role was to inspire devotion, her distance to purify the lover's desire. But courtly love was not confined to nobility. Its imagery trickled into folk songs, plays, and ballads. Even peasants sang of absent sweethearts in terms that echoed knights and ladies, their rustic verses shaped by the same ideals of loyalty and endurance. The universality of the tradition meant that everyone high or low could frame their longing as part of something noble. Distance itself became a virtue under this system. To be apart was not a failure, but a test. Lovers who endured without faltering proved themselves worthy. Some even glorified absence, arguing that it kept passion alive longer than presence ever could. Where daily life might dull affection, distance kept it sharp, like a sword never sheathed. Of course, the reality was more complicated. Many couples suffered under the weight of separation, and not all found solace in poetic ideals. Yet the tradition of courtly love gave them a way to interpret their suffering, to frame it as meaningful rather than meaningless. A woman waiting for her husband abroad could console herself with the thought that her loyalty was noble. A man pining for a distant beloved could transform his frustration into poetry, elevating his pain into art. By the 1500s, courtly love traditions also began to shift. Humanist writers emphasized individuality, personal desire, and more realistic depictions of affection. Still, the old ideals lingered, shaping how long-distance lovers expressed themselves. The image of the faithful knight and the unattainable lady survived, not because it was always true, but because it gave structure to emotions that otherwise felt unbearable. Courtly love, then, was more than literature. It was a cultural script, a way of living through distance. It offered meaning to absence, nobility to longing, and dignity to those who suffered in silence. And for the lovers of the 1500s, it was a reminder that even across miles, their devotion placed them in a timeless tradition, one that had celebrated longing for centuries, and would continue to do so for centuries to come. If poetry was the written voice of longing in the 1500s, then songs and ballads were its living heartbeat. Sung in taverns, marketplaces, or around hearths, ballads carried the stories of lovers torn apart by distance. They gave voice to the pain of separation, not just for nobles with parchment and ink, but for common men and women who endured absence in silence. Ballads of the period often told familiar tales. A sailor gone to sea while his wife waited at the shore. A soldier slain abroad while his sweetheart mourned. A maiden abandoned by a lover who never returned. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, reflected the anxieties of entire communities. Everyone had seen a neighbor's husband depart for war, or heard of a cousin who's vanished overseas. The songs were not fantasy, they were collective memory. The structure of ballads made them easy to remember. Simple rhymes, repetitive refrains, and strong rhythms allowed even the illiterate to carry them in their minds. A woman might hum a tune while working in the fields, each note a reminder of her absent husband. A soldier marching might sing verses of loyalty and longing, sharing in a tradition that connected him to countless others before him. In this way, songs became portable letters, spreading emotions across distances where ink could not travel. Absence was their central theme. Verses spoke of waiting by windows, watching the sea, or longing for a voice that might never return. Some songs expressed hope, promising reunion and joy. Others ended in tragedy, with death or betrayal. Both forms served the same purpose: to give shape to longing, to transform silence into sound. For women, ballads often became their only outlet. Unable to write letters, they expressed their love and grief through song. A lullaby sung to a child might carry hidden longing for a husband at war. A wedding song might include verses mourning a groom lost to the sea. These melodies preserved women's voices in a world that often ignored them. Communities also used songs to share collective resilience. Singing together made absence bearable. In villages where many men were gone, women might gather to sing ballads of waiting, finding comfort in shared sorrow. In armies, soldiers sang of sweethearts left behind, binding themselves with the promise of return. Music transformed isolation into solidarity. What makes these ballads remarkable is their endurance. Many were passed down through generations, surviving into the present. Though the words have shifted with time, the themes remain recognizable: loyalty, longing, betrayal, and hope. To listen to them is to hear the echo of 16th century hearts beating across the centuries. Songs and ballads also blurred the line between art and memory. For some couples, a particular tune became their private symbol, sung before parting and remembered during absence. A husband might whistle the melody of a love song as he marched away, leaving his wife to hum it at home. The song became a bond, a shared language that distance could not silence. In the 1500s, when silence threatened to swallow long-distance relationships, ballads were resistance. They declared that absence would not erase love, that even if letters were lost, even if distance stretched unbearably, the human voice could still carry devotion. For the people of the time, songs were more than entertainment. They were survival. They turned loneliness into melody, heartbreak into story, waiting into tradition. And so, while parchment crumbled and ink faded, the ballads endured reminders that love, even across the greatest distances, will always find a way to be heard. In the 1500s, Europe was far from a single cultural unit. Different regions had distinct traditions, values, and social structures that shaped how people experienced long-distance love. The way separation was endured in Northern Europe often contrasted sharply with practices in the South, where climate, religion, and politics influenced everything from marriage customs to correspondence. In Northern Europe, England, the German states, and Scandinavia, Protestant reforms began reshaping family life. Marriage was increasingly emphasized as a partnership rooted in faith and mutual duty, rather than solely political arrangement. Husbands and wives, though still bound by social expectations, were encouraged by reformers like Martin Luther to correspond and support each other emotionally. Letters from Northern Europe often carried both spiritual and romantic tones, reflecting the idea that a spouse was not only a partner in household affairs, but also in salvation. Distance, in this context, was framed as a test of both love and faith. A Protestant husband abroad might assure his wife not only of his fidelity, but also of his prayers for her. A wife might respond with verses of scripture, blending personal longing with spiritual encouragement. In these letters, absence was interpreted through the lens of God's providence. Every delay, every silence was part of a divine plan. In Southern Europe, particularly in Catholic Spain and Italy, marriage and love were shaped more strongly by tradition, hierarchy, and family honor. Marriages were often arranged with little input from the couple, and women's correspondence was tightly controlled. Letters between lovers, especially those not sanctioned by families, were viewed with suspicion. Privacy was rare. A noblewoman's words were often dictated by expectation, carefully monitored to avoid scandal. Yet Southern Europe also had its own rich traditions of romance, fueled by centuries of troubadour poetry and Renaissance art. Love was often expressed in extravagant metaphors, with absence described as burning passion or divine suffering. While Northern letters leaned toward sober piety, Southern expressions of distance were often theatrical, filled with imagery of flames, wounds, and stars. Lovers elevated their longing into poetry, turning absence into art. Climate and geography also played subtle roles. In the north, long winters and difficult travel meant that separations were often seasonal sailors waiting for thawed ports, farmers traveling during harvest. In the south, Mediterranean trade and exploration carried men much farther, for much longer. Southern women were more likely to wait years for husbands engaged in voyages to the New World or wars in Africa. Their letters and prayers stretched across oceans rather than borders. The role of honor further distinguished the regions. In Spain and Italy, family honor was paramount. A woman suspected of betrayal while her husband was absent risked not only personal disgrace, but also the shame of her entire household. In Northern Europe, reputation mattered too, but Protestant emphasis on individual faith created slightly more room for private expression. Despite these differences, one thread united North and South: distance was universal, whether filtered through Protestant sobriety or Catholic passion. The experience of waiting, doubting, and longing shaped lives across the continent. Each region expressed it differently, but the heartache was the same. Northern Europe framed distance as discipline, endured with prayer and patience. Southern Europe framed it as passion, endured with fiery words and desperate vows. Together, they reveal how culture shaped not the existence of long-distance love, but its expression. For those living in the 1500s, geography did not determine whether they suffered absence, but it did determine how they gave voice to it. The 1500s were an age of contrast, not only between North and South, but also between East and West. Western Europe, England, France, Spain, the Italian states, was dominated by the Renaissance, the Reformation, and overseas exploration. Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Balkans, and the edges of the Ottoman Empire was shaped by a different reality. Shifting borders, multi-ethnic societies, and the constant presence of war These differences deeply influenced how long-distance relationships were experienced. In Western Europe, distance was often tied to exploration and commerce. Husbands and sons departed for the Americas, Africa, or Asia, seeking wealth and glory. Wives and families waited for years, sustained by occasional letters that crossed oceans. Absence was measured in miles of sea and months of silence. For Western Europeans, long-distance love was increasingly global, reflecting Europe's expanding reach. In Eastern Europe, by contrast, distance was tied more closely to war and shifting allegiances. The Ottoman Empire pushed into Hungary and the Balkans, while Poland, Lithuania, and Russia grappled with invasions and conflicts. Men left not to chase wealth across oceans, but to defend borders or fight in endless campaigns. For women, this meant that absence was sudden and unpredictable. A husband could be called away at a moment's notice, leaving her to manage the household under threat of invasion. Letters in Eastern Europe were also more vulnerable. Borders were unstable, roads unsafe, and literacy less widespread. A Polish nobleman fighting far from home might send messages through soldiers or traveling merchants, but delivery was uncertain. For peasants, letters were rare luxuries, and distance was endured mostly in silence. Love was preserved less through writing and more through memory, oral vows, and tokens exchanged before departure. Religion played a crucial role in this East-West divide. In the West, Catholic and Protestant tensions shaped how couples expressed absence through fiery passion or sober faith. In the East, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Islam overlapped, creating more complex barriers. Lovers separated by faith faced challenges not only of geography but of belief. A Christian woman in the Balkans might fall in love with a Muslim soldier or an Orthodox man with a Catholic bride, but their unions were policed by both families and religious authorities. Here, long-distance love was not just personal longing, it was survival within fragile coexistence. Another difference lay in tradition. Western Europe embraced courtly love, Renaissance poetry, and ballads to frame absence as noble and even beautiful. In Eastern Europe, folk traditions emphasized endurance and suffering. Songs told of brides waiting for husbands lost in endless wars, of mothers mourning sons who never returned. These laments carried less romantic idealism and more raw grief, reflecting the harsher realities of borderlands constantly under siege. For women, the burden of waiting was heavy everywhere, but heavier still in the East. A Western merchant's wife might wait for years, uncertain but relatively safe in her home. An Eastern soldier's wife might endure not only absence, but also raids, famine, or displacement. Her waiting was not peaceful patience, but active survival, caring for children and land while fearing for her life. Yet, across both regions, one truth remained. Distance tested love, and love adapted. In the West, it became poetic, global, and tied to exploration. In the East, it became resilient, pragmatic, and tied to survival. Both forms were expressions of the same human need: to hold on to connection when the world tore it away. The contrast between East and West shows us that while absence was universal, its meaning depended on context. For the West, absence was a challenge of oceans and discovery. For the East, absence was a challenge of war and endurance. And in both, the human heart persisted. The 1500s were the century when Europe's horizons expanded beyond its own continent. Voyages across the Atlantic carried explorers, settlers, merchants, and missionaries to the New World. But while these journeys promised wealth and discovery, they also created some of the most painful long-distance separations of the age. For Europeans, sending a loved one across the ocean was unlike any other form of absence. War might take a husband for months, trade for years, but voyages to the Americas often meant indefinite separation. Many never returned. Storms, disease, and conflict claimed thousands of lives, and letters sent across oceans were rare and unreliable. For wives and families left behind, waiting became an act of faith, with little hope of certainty. When letters did arrive, they carried immense weight. A single page from Mexico, Brazil, or the Caribbean might take months to cross the Atlantic. Delivered by fragile ships and uncertain couriers, families clung to these words as proof of survival, reading them again and again until the ink blurred. But silence was far more common. Many women waited for years without news, torn between hope and despair, never knowing whether they were wives or widows. For those who traveled, distance was no less heavy. Settlers and soldiers in the New World lived in isolation, surrounded by unfamiliar landscapes and cultures. Their longing for home filled their diaries and letters, where they described European fields, festivals, and loved ones with aching nostalgia. The further they went, the more Europe became a dreamer, memory carried in ink and song. The New World also created cultural clashes in love. European men sometimes formed relationships with indigenous women, whether through alliance, survival, or affection. These unions, however, were often viewed with suspicion by European society. Letters describing them rarely survived, but reports from missionaries and officials reveal the tensions they caused. For wives waiting in Europe, rumors of such relationships only deepened their suffering. Distance became not only geographical, but moral and cultural. Meanwhile, indigenous peoples also experienced the pain of distance under colonization. Men taken for labor or war were separated from their families for long stretches, sometimes forever. Women whose husbands died in European conflicts faced the same endless waiting as their European counterparts. In this sense, the experience of absence was tragically universal. Across oceans and cultures, love was tested by loss. What made New World separations unique was their finality. While a European wife might hope for her husband's safe return from France, Italy, or Germany, a woman whose husband sailed for the Americas knew that she might never see him again. Some did reunite, years later, with wealth or stories of survival. But for many, departure was farewell in disguise. This transatlantic distance reshaped love itself. Couples began to frame promises not only around fidelity but around memory. If I do not return, remember me. Love letters from this period often included spiritual consolation, urging partners to trust in God even if reunion never came. Love was not only about waiting for return, but about preparing for the possibility of eternal absence. Across Europe and the New World, cultural differences shaped how people endured distance. Europeans leaned on poetry, ritual, and tradition to make sense of absence. Indigenous peoples relied on oral storytelling, community bonds, and ritual mourning. But in both, the essence was the same. The human heart seeking to endure what seemed unendurable. The expansion of Europe into the New World revealed the harshest form of long distance. Love in the 1500s. Love stretched across oceans so vast that absence often became permanent. And yet, even then, letters, songs, and promises carried devotion across the waves, proof that love traveled as far as ships could sail. When we look back at the 1500s, it is easy to see the differences between their world and ours. Letters carried by horse instead of instant messages. Voyages measured in years instead of hours. Silences that lasted seasons instead of seconds. Yet, Despite the vast gap of time, many of the ways people experienced and expressed long-distance love in that century still shape us today. The first enduring element is the power of the written word. In the 1500s, love letters were treasures, rare, fragile, and deeply meaningful. Every sentence carried weight, because it might be the only message received for months. This legacy remains with us. Even in a digital age, handwritten letters are still considered intimate, powerful, and enduring. The tradition of putting love into words, born of necessity in the past, has become a cultural symbol of devotion. Second, the 1500s gave us the language of poetry and metaphor in love. Courtly traditions, Renaissance sonnets, and ballads of absence established the way we speak about distance even now. To call someone a guiding star, or to describe absence as painful longing, are phrases inherited from centuries of poetic tradition. Lovers today, whether knowingly or not, still borrow from the imagery created in those centuries of separation. Third, the idea of tokens of love rings, locks of hair, or small objects carried across distance was central to the 1500s. These items were substitutes for presents, held as proof of devotion. The practice survives today in keepsakes, jewelry, or gifts exchanged before long journeys. Modern couples may not carry locks of hair, but they still cling to photographs, clothing, or shared mementos that serve the same purpose. Tangible evidence of connection. Another legacy is the concept of fidelity under distance. In the 1500s, trust was both fragile and vital. Distance magnified suspicion, but also elevated loyalty into something heroic. That expectation of faithfulness across absence continues to define long-distance relationships today. We still measure devotion by the ability to endure separation without betrayal. The standard set centuries ago of waiting, of trusting, of holding fast remains a moral ideal. The influence of music and storytelling is also lasting. Ballads sung by wives waiting at the shore, poems written by exiled lovers, and laments passed through villages created a shared cultural memory of absence. Today's love songs, movies, and novels continue that tradition. The mediums have changed, but the themes, waiting, longing, reunion, and heartbreak are exactly the same. Even the very idea that absence can intensify love is a legacy of the 1500s. The age of courtly love taught that distance was not only a curse, but also a test, one that purified and proved devotion. Many people still believe this today, that time apart strengthens relationships, that longing deepens affection. This is an inheritance from centuries when absence was unavoidable, and people had to find meaning in it. Perhaps the deepest legacy is this: the understanding that love is not confined by geography. The lovers of the 1500s proved, through patience, risk, and courage, that affection could survive oceans, wars, and silence. Their resilience created a tradition of believing in love beyond presence. That belief continues to sustain us in a world where distance, though smaller, still exists. What endured from the 1500s then is not only their practices, but their spirit, their refusal to let absence silence the heart. For lovers of the 1500s, distance was measured in months of silence, in letters that might never arrive, in promises tested by absence. Today, we live in a different world, one where oceans can be crossed in hours and messages in seconds. Yet the contrast between then and now reveals how much technology has reshaped the very meaning of long-distance love. The first great transformation came with the printing press in the late 15th century, spreading literacy more widely. By the 1500s, the ability to read and write, once confined to elites, was reaching merchants, craftsmen, and even some farmers. This meant that love letters became more common, not only among nobles, but also among ordinary people. Technology gave more couples the power to write their longing into words, rather than rely on memory or oral traditions. Centuries later, the postal system institutionalized what was fragile in the Renaissance. Where a letter once relied on chance couriers, later societies developed reliable networks that promised delivery. For long-distance couples, this meant absence could be softened by steady correspondence. The legacy of the 1500s, the letter as a lifeline, was carried forward, but with less uncertainty. The invention of the telegraph in the 19th century collapsed distance even further. Lovers could now send short messages across continents in minutes. Though the telegraph lacked the poetry of a handwritten letter, it introduced a new dimension: immediacy. Separation was still painful, but silence no longer had to stretch endlessly. Then came the telephone, allowing lovers to hear each other's voices across miles. For the first time in history, absence did not mean silence. The emotional intensity of hearing a beloved's voice, something impossible in the 1500s, revolutionized the experience of distance. Words no longer needed to be mediated by couriers, scribes, or symbols. They became immediate, personal, and alive. In the modern age, the rise of air travel transformed separation yet again. A journey that once took months by ship could now be done in a day. Lovers divided by oceans could reunite quickly, a possibility unthinkable for a wife waiting for her merchant husband in 1540. Distance shrank, not because the world grew smaller, but because technology gave us wings. The digital revolution has taken this even further. Today, video calls, instant messaging, and social media allow couples to share daily lives across continents. A lover can send a message from London to New York in seconds, share a photo, or speak face-to-face through a screen. What once demanded patience and faith can now be answered with a notification. And yet, while technology has eased the pain of distance, it has not erased it. Modern long-distance couples face different struggles: the lack of physical presence, the temptation of constant surveillance, the fatigue of digital communication. The silence that once tested couples has been replaced by another kind of pressure: the demand to always be available, always connected. Comparing the 1500s to today highlights a paradox. Lovers then endured silence, but often gave more weight to their words, knowing each letter could be their only one. Lovers now enjoy constant connection, but sometimes risk taking it for granted. Technology has solved the problem of absence, but not the mystery of longing. What technology has truly changed is the scale of distance. In the 1500s, separation was often measured in miles, across kingdoms or oceans. But the emotional challenge was the same as it is today: to remain faithful, to remain connected, to endure. The tools are different, but the essence is unchanged. Technology has given us speed, reliability, and voice. But the legacy of the 1500s reminds us that love at a distance is not defined by tools, but by the courage to believe in connection despite absence. Looking back at the 1500s, we might be tempted to see their long-distance relationships as relics of a harsher world: silence. Months of waiting, tokens in place of presence. Yet, the lessons from that age are surprisingly relevant today. Even in a world of instant communication, love across distance remains a challenge. And the voices of the past still speak truths we can carry into modern life. Lesson 1. Words matter. In the 1500s, a single letter might be all a couple had for months. Every word carried weight, crafted with care because it had to sustain love through silence. Today, with instant messages and video calls, words often flow more casually. But the legacy of the past reminds us that meaning deepens when words are chosen carefully. A heartfelt letter or even a thoughtful message can still serve as a treasure, just as it did centuries ago. Lesson 2. Tokens have power. For Renaissance lovers, objects bridged absence. A ring, a ribbon, a lock of hair, these tokens were proof of devotion when nothing else was possible. Modern couples may not exchange hair or handkerchiefs, but the principle endures. Photographs, gifts, or even digital mementos serve the same role. Love often needs something tangible to hold on to, especially in absence. The 1500s remind us that symbols of connection can sustain the heart when presence is impossible. Lesson 3. Trust is everything. In a world of silence, lovers of the 1500s had nothing but faith. They endured gossip, delay, and doubt, yet clung to promises. Today, technology gives us constant access, but trust is still the foundation. Without it, no amount of texts or calls can sustain love. Their world teaches us that trust is not a convenience, it is the very heart of long-distance devotion. Lesson 4. Distance can deepen love. Courtly traditions reframed absence as noble, a test that purified affection. While that language may seem exaggerated, the principle remains. Distance, though painful, can strengthen bonds. It forces couples to value presence when it comes, to cultivate patience, and to discover new ways of expressing intimacy. The lovers of the 1500s knew this instinctively, and their resilience proves its truth. Lesson 5. Love is timeless. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that the human heart has not changed. Whether waiting at a window in 1540 or staring at a glowing phone screen today, lovers endure the same ache, the longing for closeness, the hope for reunion, the fear of betrayal. Technology changes tools, but not feelings. By studying their struggles, we recognize ourselves in them and gain perspective on our own endurance. Finally, the legacy of long-distance love in the 1500s teaches us to treat absence not just as an obstacle, but as a story. Their songs, poems, and letters transformed longing into art. Our modern equivalents, texts, playlists, even social media posts can serve the same purpose. Absence is not only pain, it can also be creativity. Proof that love is strong enough to speak across miles. In the end, what the 1500s offer us is not nostalgia for a world of silence, but respect for resilience. They remind us that love, even when stretched across oceans or torn by war, can survive. It can adapt, it can endure. And if they could hold fast with nothing but ink, parchment, and faith, then surely we with all our tools can do the same. Long-distance love today is easier in many ways, but it is no less meaningful. And the lovers of the 1500s, waiting by windows, whispering prayers, and sending fragile letters across dangerous roads, remind us of a simple truth. Love does not end where distance begins.